The gunshot echoed across the frozen valley as Nora Fletcher ducked behind the weathered trunk of a fallen pine, her breath forming clouds in the bitter winter air of 1879. She'd never imagined her 23rd birthday would end with her fleeing for her life through the snow-covered wilderness of northern New Mexico territory, miles from the safety of Pino's Altos. "I see her tracks. This way." The gruff voice of Rex Calhoun carried through the trees, sending a fresh wave of terror through Nora's body as she forced herself deeper into the forest, her boots sinking into knee-deep snow with each desperate step. 3 days ago, she'd been the respected schoolteacher of Pino's Altos, daughter of the late mining engineer Frederick Fletcher. Now she was prey, hunted by the most dangerous gang in the territory after witnessing something she never should have seen. The Calhoun brothers murdering the territorial marshal in cold blood behind her father's old mining office. Nora pressed forward, fighting against the numbing cold that seeped through her woolen coat. The dress she wore beneath it, practical as it was for teaching, offered little protection against the biting wind that whipped down from the mountains. Her fingers, despite the gloves, had long since lost feeling, and she knew that even if she evaded the Calhouns, the wilderness itself might claim her life before morning. The snow began falling harder as the afternoon light faded. Nora could hear the occasional distant shouts of the outlaws as they tracked her through the forest. There were 3 of them: Rex, the oldest and most vicious; Miles, the tracker who could follow a ghost through a blizzard; and Jeb, the youngest, barely 20 but already with blood on his hands. A branch snapped behind her, much closer than she'd expected. Nora whirled around, nearly losing her balance in the deep snow. "Come on out, teacher lady," Rex's voice called, closer now. "You can't survive the night out here anyway. Make it easy on yourself." Nora bit back a sob and pushed forward, the mountains rising before her like jagged teeth against the darkening sky. She had no destination, no plan beyond staying ahead of the killers who pursued her. Pino's Altos was at least 15 miles behind her now, and the nearest settlement in this direction was Fort Bayard, still another day's journey even in good conditions. The light was fading fast when Nora spotted a ridge of snow ahead, unnaturally smooth against the chaotic forest floor. Perhaps it concealed a depression where she could hide, at least temporarily. With her remaining strength, she struggled toward it, praying for some kind of miracle. Her foot caught on a hidden root, sending her tumbling forward into the snow. Pain shot through her ankle as she tried to stand, and she realized with horror that she might have sprained it. The voices behind her grew louder, more excited they had seen her fall. "Got you now," Miles Calhoun's voice rang out triumphantly. Nora crawled desperately toward the snowdrift, tears freezing on her cheeks. This couldn't be how her story ended, not like this, not at the hands of men like the Calhouns. "There she is," Jeb shouted, and a bullet splintered the trunk of a tree just feet from her head. Nora closed her eyes, waiting for the next shot, when suddenly the world exploded in sound and fury. Multiple gunshots rang out in rapid succession, but they weren't aimed at her. From behind the massive snowdrift she'd been crawling toward, a tall figure rose like an avenging spirit, rifle steady in gloved hands as he fired with deadly precision at her pursuers. "Get down," the stranger commanded, his voice deep and steady even as chaos erupted around them. Nora pressed herself flat against the ground as more shots were exchanged. She heard a scream of pain, then angry shouts as the Calhouns retreated back into the trees. In the momentary silence that followed, Nora raised her head to see her unexpected savior crouching down beside her. His face was partially hidden by a thick woolen scarf, but his eyes were startlingly blue against his wind-burned skin. He wore the practical garb of a frontiersman, thick coat, sturdy pants tucked into well-worn boots, and a wide-brimmed hat crusted with snow. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice softer now but still urgent. I think I twisted my ankle," Nora managed, her voice trembling from cold and fear. The man nodded once, then glanced back toward the forest where the outlaws had disappeared. "They'll be back once they regroup. We need to move now." Without waiting for her response, he slung his rifle over his shoulder and scooped Nora into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. "I have a cabin about 2 miles from here," he said, already moving through the snow with surprising ease despite his burden. "Name's Henry Grayson. And you'd better have a good reason for bringing Rex Calhoun and his boys to my doorstep in the middle of winter." The journey to Henry's cabin was a blur of pain and cold for Nora. She tried to stay alert, knowing that the Calhouns could reappear at any moment, but the rhythmic motion of Henry's determined strides through the snow, and the warmth of his body against hers lulled her into a state of semi-consciousness. When she fully came to her senses again, they were approaching a small, sturdy cabin nestled against the side of a hill. Smoke rose from its stone chimney, promising warmth within. A lean-to stable stood nearby, where Nora could make out the shape of a horse shifting restlessly. "We made it," Henry said, his breath labored now from the exertion of carrying her through the deep snow. "But we're not safe yet. Those men aren't the type to give up easily." He kicked at the cabin door, which swung open to reveal a simple but orderly interior. A fire burned low in the hearth, and the single room contained a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, a cooking area, and shelves lined with supplies. It was the home of a man accustomed to living alone and providing for himself. Henry set Nora down gently on a chair near the fire and immediately moved to secure the door with a heavy wooden bar. He then went to each of the cabin's 2 small windows, checking that the wooden shutters were closed tight before returning to Nora's side. "Let me see that ankle," he said, kneeling before her and gently removing her snow-covered boot. His hands were large but surprisingly gentle as he examined her injury, his face now fully visible in the firelight. Nora studied him as he worked. Henry Grayson appeared to be in his early 30s, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of beard, and those remarkable blue eyes set in a face weathered by years in the wilderness. A small scar ran along his left cheekbone, and his dark hair fell in waves to his collar. "It's not broken," he announced after a moment. "Just a bad sprain. I'll wrap it for you, but you won't be running anywhere for at least a few days." He paused, fixing her with a direct gaze. "Which means you'd better start explaining who you are and why those men want you dead badly enough to chase you into this God-forsaken country in the middle of winter." Nora swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how completely she was at the mercy of this stranger. Henry Grayson had saved her life, but she knew nothing about him. For all she knew, he could be as dangerous as the Calhouns in his own way. "My name is Nora Fletcher," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. "I'm the school teacher in Pino's Altos." Henry's eyebrows rose slightly. "Long way from town, school teacher." "I had no choice," Nora said, watching as he efficiently wrapped her ankle with a clean strip of cloth. 3 days ago, I was working late at the schoolhouse. It's next to my father's old mining office he passed last year, but the building is still there. I heard voices outside, men arguing. When I looked out the window, I saw Marshal Davis confronting the Calhoun brothers about cattle that had been stolen from the Hendersons' ranch. Henry's hand stilled momentarily, and let me guess, it didn't end well for the marshal. Nora closed her eyes briefly, the memory still horrifyingly fresh. Rex shot him without warning right in the chest. The marshal never even drew his weapon, I must have made a sound because they looked toward the schoolhouse. I ran out the back, but Miles saw me. She shivered. They've been hunting me ever since. Why didn't you go to the deputy marshal? Or leave town on the stage? Henry asked, finishing with her ankle and moving to add more wood to the fire. The deputy was away in Silver City, and the cowhounds were watching the roads and the stage depot. I managed to hide with a friend for the first night, but they started searching houses. I couldn't put anyone else in danger, so I decided to try reaching Fort Bayard on foot. She looked down at her bandaged ankle. I didn't account for the weather. Henry stood, towering over her as he considered her story. The cowhounds don't leave witnesses, he said finally, and they know these mountains better than most. They'll find this cabin eventually. Fear clutched at Nora's heart again. I'm sorry I've brought this trouble to you, Mr. Grayson. Perhaps if you could loan me your horse in this weather with that ankle, you wouldn't make it 5 miles. Henry shook his head decisively. No, we'll stay here tonight. I know a few tricks that might buy us some time. Tomorrow we'll figure out our next move. Nora watched as he moved around the cabin with purpose, gathering ammunition for his rifle and checking a revolver he took from a shelf. You seem familiar with situations like this, she observed cautiously. Henry's mouth twisted in what might have been a smile. Let's just say I've had my own run-ins with men like the cowhounds. He handed her a cup of water. Rest now. I'll keep watch. As night fell fully outside, the wind rising to a howl around the small cabin, Nora found herself studying her rescuer with growing curiosity. Henry Grayson moved with the quiet confidence of a man comfortable with himself and his surroundings. There was something in his manner, a watchfulness, a readiness that suggested he was more than just a frontiersman living alone in the wilderness. Were you a lawman? She asked finally as he cleaned his rifle by the firelight. Henry's hands never paused in their work. Once, he said simply, a long time ago. What happened? His blue eyes lifted to meet hers. I made a mistake. People died. I left. The stark honesty of his answer surprised her. Is that why you live all the way out here alone? Partly, he admitted. It's simpler this way. I hunt, I trap, I trade furs and meat in Fort Bayard a few times a year. No one expects anything from me, and I don't have to worry about failing anyone. Nora absorbed this, seeing the pain behind his matter-of-fact words. That sounds lonely. For the first time, Henry Grayson looked genuinely surprised. I suppose it is, he said after a moment, as if the thought had never occurred to him before. But loneliness is safer than the alternative. Before Nora could respond, a sound outside caught Henry's attention. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, motioning for her to be silent. For several long moments, they both listened as the wind moaned around the cabin's walls. Then came the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking under weight, not the wind, but someone moving outside. They found us faster than I expected, Henry whispered, moving silently to extinguish the lantern, leaving only the dim glow of the fire to illuminate the cabin. Stay low and keep away from the windows. Nora's heart pounded as she slid from the chair to the floor, her injured ankle sending sharp pains up her leg despite the bandage. She watched as Henry positioned himself beside one of the small windows, carefully easing the shutter open just enough to peer outside. A gunshot shattered the night, the bullet splintering the window frame inches from Henry's head. He ducked down, muttering a curse. Grayson. Rex Calhoun's voice boomed outside. We know you're in there with the Fletcher woman. Send her out and maybe we'll let you live. Henry moved to Nora's side, his expression grim in the firelight. There are at least 2 of them out there, probably all 3. They've got us surrounded. What do we do? Nora whispered, fear clawing at her throat. Henry's jaw tightened. We have 2 choices. Make a stand here or try to slip away using my emergency exit. Emergency exit, he nodded toward the back of the cabin. This place used to be an old mining claim shelter before I took it over. There's a small tunnel that leads out to a ravine about 100 yards east. It's narrow and rough going, especially with your ankle, but it might be our best chance. Another shot hit the cabin wall, followed by Miles Calhoun's voice. You've got 1 minute, Grayson, then we burn you out. Henry made his decision. The tunnel it is. He moved quickly, dragging the narrow bed aside to reveal a trapdoor in the wooden floor. I'll go first and help you through. The passage is tight, so we'll have to move carefully. He lifted the trapdoor to reveal a dark opening barely large enough for a man to fit through. The smell of damp earth rose from below. Henry grabbed a small lantern, lit it from the fire, and lowered it into the hole. How did you know this was here? Nora asked as he helped her toward the opening. I chose this cabin precisely because of this tunnel, Henry replied, his voice low. A man in my position needs an escape route. Outside, they could hear the Calhounds moving closer to the cabin, their voices carrying in the night air as they coordinated their attack. The smell of smoke suddenly drifted through the cracks in the walls. They had started a fire against the cabin's exterior. Go now, Henry urged, helping Nora ease her legs into the tunnel opening. I'll be right behind you. The tunnel was even narrower than it had appeared, forcing Nora to crawl on her hands and knees, pain shooting through her injured ankle with every movement. The earthen passage was shored up with old timbers at irregular intervals, evidence of its mining origins. In places, the ceiling hung so low that she had to flatten herself against the ground to squeeze through. Behind her, Henry followed close, the light from his small lantern casting eerie shadows on the tunnel walls. They moved as quickly as possible, the sounds of the Calhounds' attack on the cabin growing fainter behind them. They had crawled perhaps 50 yards when a tremendous boom shook the earth around them, sending dirt and small rocks showering down from the ceiling. They've blown up the cabin, Henry said grimly. Move faster if you can. They'll discover the tunnel entrance soon. Nora pushed forward with renewed urgency, ignoring the pain in her ankle and the scrapes on her hands and knees. The tunnel began to slope upward, and ahead she could see a faint lightening in the darkness, the exit. When they finally emerged into the open air, they found themselves in a narrow ravine, the night sky visible as a strip of star-filled darkness above them. The wind had died down somewhat, but the cold hit Nora with renewed force after the relative shelter of the tunnel. The cabin, Henry said, looking back toward a glow of firelight visible through the trees on the hillside behind them. Flames were now engulfing the small structure completely. I'm so sorry, Nora whispered, guilt washing over her at the destruction of his home. Henry shook his head, his expression unreadable in the dim light. It's just a cabin, can be rebuilt. He scanned their surroundings with practiced efficiency. We need to move. The horse is gone, they'll have found him in the lean-to, but we still have a chance if we can reach my winter cache. Winter cache? Nora questioned as he helped her to her feet. Supplies stash about 3 miles east of here. Food, weapons, warm clothes, enough to keep us alive until we can figure out our next move. He looked at her doubtfully. But with your ankle. I can make it, Nora said with determination, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. I won't slow you down. Henry's expression softened slightly. Here. He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, leaving himself in just a wool shirt and vest. You need this more than I do. But you'll freeze, Nora protested. I'm used to the cold, he said simply. And we'll be moving. That keeps the blood flowing. Without further discussion, he helped her into the coat and then fashioned a makeshift walking stick from a fallen branch. Lean on this, and on me when you need to. They set off through the snow, following the ravine for a while before Henry led them up a steep embankment and into the forest proper. The going was slow and difficult, especially for Nora, but Henry never showed impatience. He matched his pace to hers, steadying her when she stumbled, occasionally carrying her across particularly challenging terrain. The night grew colder as they traveled, the snow starting to fall again in large, lazy flakes that clung to their hair and clothing. Henry kept them moving steadily eastward, navigating by the stars when they were visible and by some internal compass when they were not. "How far have we come?" Nora asked after what felt like hours of trudging through the snow. "About 2 miles," Henry replied, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Not much further to the cache." Nora nodded, too exhausted to speak further. Her ankle throbbed mercilessly, and despite Henry's coat, the cold had seeped into her bones. She focused on placing one foot in front of the other, leaning heavily on the walking stick and occasionally on Henry's strong arm. They had just started to descend a gentle slope when Henry suddenly froze, his hand shooting out to stop Nora. "What is it?" she whispered, instantly alert despite her exhaustion. Henry didn't answer immediately, his head tilted as he listened intently. Then Nora heard it too, the distant sound of voices carried on the wind. "They're tracking us," Henry said, his voice tight. "They must have found the tunnel exit." "How?" "In this darkness, Miles Calhoun can track a ghost," Henry said, echoing Nora's own earlier thought. "And they're probably using torches." He scanned the surrounding forest quickly. "We need to throw them off our trail." Without warning, he scooped Nora into his arms again and began moving sideways along the slope rather than continuing downward. "What are you doing?" she asked, clinging to his neck as he carried her through the snow. "There's a creek about a 1/4 mile this way," he explained, moving as quickly as he dared in the darkness. "If we can reach it and follow it downstream for a while, it might confuse our trail enough to buy us some time." The creek, when they reached it, was partially frozen, with water still flowing beneath a thin crust of ice near the center. Henry set Nora down carefully on the bank. "We need to walk in the water," he said, his expression apologetic. "It's the only way to hide our tracks completely." Nora looked at the dark, icy water with dread but nodded her understanding. "Let's do it." Henry helped her remove her boots and stockings, then did the same himself. The shock of the frigid water as they stepped into the creek nearly took Nora's breath away, but she bit back her cry, knowing that any sound might carry to their pursuers. They waded downstream, the water never rising above their calves but numbing their feet and legs within minutes. Henry supported much of Nora's weight, allowing her to lean heavily against him as they moved through the painful cold. After what seemed an eternity, but was probably no more than 15 minutes, Henry guided them back to the creek bank and helped Nora onto dry land. Their feet were bloodless white, and Nora could barely feel them as Henry quickly dried them with a bandana from his pocket and helped her put her stockings and boots back on. "Wiggle your toes," he instructed as he pulled on his own boots. "Keep the blood moving." "We can't stop long enough to warm them properly yet." Nora did as she was told, wincing as painful pins and needles began to replace the numbness. Henry was already scanning the forest again, listening for any sign of pursuit. "I think it worked," he said finally. "I don't hear them anymore. But we need to keep moving. The cache is just beyond that ridge." He pointed to a rocky outcropping barely visible in the darkness ahead. They set off again, both moving more stiffly now as they fought against the effects of their icy wade. The snow continued to fall, covering their tracks almost as quickly as they made them, which Henry noted was both a blessing and a curse, good for hiding their trail, but making travel even more difficult. When they finally reached the rocky ridge Henry had indicated, Nora was nearly at the end of her endurance. Her sprained ankle felt as if it were on fire, and the rest of her body trembled with cold and exhaustion. "Almost there," Henry encouraged, his own voice rough with fatigue. He led her along the base of the ridge until they came to a narrow crevice between two large boulders. "In here." The crevice widened into a small cave, just large enough for a person to stand upright in its center. Henry fumbled in the darkness until he found and lit a candle stub that had been left on a natural shelf in the rock wall. The flickering light revealed a well-organized collection of supplies: a small barrel, several bundles wrapped in oilcloth, a stack of firewood, and what appeared to be extra clothing and blankets. "Your cache," Nora breathed in relief. Henry nodded, already pulling blankets from the stack. "We can rest here. The entrance is hidden from view, and with this snowfall, no one will find our tracks to this spot." He handed her a blanket. "Wrap yourself in this while I get a fire started." He worked quickly, building a small fire in a ring of stones that had clearly been used for this purpose before. The cave was small enough that it warmed quickly once the flames were established, and Nora felt life returning to her frozen limbs as she huddled close to the heat. Henry rummaged through his supplies, producing dried meat, hardtack, and a small pot that he filled with snow to melt for tea. He also found a jar of salve which he applied gently to Nora's ankle after unwrapping the bandage to check on the swelling. "It looks worse," he commented, his fingers careful on her tender skin. "But that's to be expected after the way we've been traveling." He reapplied the bandage, his touch so gentle that Nora found herself studying his face as he worked, noting the concentration in his blue eyes and the way his dark hair fell forward as he bent over her ankle. "Thank you," she said softly when he finished, "for everything. You've saved my life multiple times in just a few hours." Henry looked up, seeming almost embarrassed by her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Nora shook her head firmly. "Most people wouldn't have. Most would have sent me on my way or handed me over to the cowhounds to save themselves." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been growing in her mind since he'd rescued her. "Why did you help me, Mr. Grayson? Why put yourself at risk for a stranger?" Henry was silent for a long moment, feeding small sticks to the fire. "Henry," he said finally, "call me Henry, and I helped because—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Because there was a time when I didn't help someone who needed it. I've been trying to make up for that ever since, I suppose." The simple honesty of his answer touched something in Nora. "Will you tell me what happened? With your mistake, the one you mentioned before." Henry's jaw tightened, and for a moment Nora thought he wouldn't answer. But then he sighed, his shoulders dropping slightly. "I was a deputy U.S. Marshal based in Denver," he began, his voice low. 5 years ago, I was transporting a prisoner, a young man accused of robbing a bank. He claimed he was innocent, that he'd been set up by the real robbers." Henry's eyes grew distant, focused on some point in the past. "I didn't believe him. The evidence seemed clear, and he had a record of minor offenses." Henry paused, pouring the now boiling water into 2 tin cups and adding pine needle tea. "On the second night, we were ambushed by 3 men. They killed my prisoner, executed him right in front of me after saying he should have kept his mouth shut about who really robbed the bank." "The real robbers," Nora said softly. Henry nodded. "They shot me too, left me for dead. When I recovered, I learned that the young man had been telling the truth all along. There was evidence that came to light after his death that proved his innocence." His voice grew harder. "But by then it was too late. He was dead because I didn't listen, didn't protect him properly." "That wasn't your fault," Nora said, reaching out to touch his arm. "I was responsible for him," Henry replied, his eyes meeting hers. "Just like I'm responsible for you now." He handed her a cup of tea. "Drink this. It will help warm you from the inside." Nora accepted the cup, understanding that the conversation about his past was over for now. "What's our plan?" she asked instead. "We can't stay here forever." "We'll rest until first light," Henry said, "then make our way to Fort Bayard. It's about 20 miles from here, a hard journey in these conditions, but we have supplies now, and there's an old trapper's cabin about halfway that we can use for shelter tomorrow night." "And then what? Will I be safe at Fort Bayard?" Henry considered this. "The fort has army officers who can protect you until the territorial authorities arrange for a proper investigation. The Cowhounds are wanted men. Your testimony could finally bring them to justice." "If we make it that far," Nora said, unable to keep the worry from her voice. "We will," Henry assured her with a confidence that she found herself believing despite everything. "Now eat something, then get some sleep. I'll keep watch." Nora accepted the dried meat and hardtack he offered, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. They ate in companionable silence, the small fire casting flickering shadows on the cave walls around them. Despite the danger still lurking outside, Nora felt safer than she had since fleeing Pino's Altos 3 days earlier. When she had finished eating, Henry helped her arrange a bed of blankets near the fire. "Sleep," he urged. "You need to recover your strength." Exhaustion washed over Nora as soon as she lay down, the events of the day catching up with her all at once. The last thing she saw before closing her eyes was Henry sitting near the cave entrance, his rifle across his knees, his profile strong and watchful in the firelight. Nora woke to the soft gray light of dawn filtering through the cave entrance. For a moment she was disoriented, the events of the previous day seeming like a terrible dream. Then she tried to move and felt the sharp pain in her ankle, bringing reality rushing back. Henry was still seated near the entrance, though he had moved to tend the fire, which burned low now. He looked tired but alert, his eyes clear as they met hers. "Morning," he said, offering a small smile that transformed his serious face. "How's the ankle?" Nora carefully flexed her foot, wincing. "Still painful, but I think the rest helped." Henry nodded, coming to examine it himself. His hands were warm as he gently probed the swelling. "Better than I expected," he said. "Think you can travel today if we take it slow?" "Yes," Nora said with more confidence than she felt. She knew they couldn't afford to delay, not with the Cowhounds still hunting them. Henry helped her sit up and offered her more tea and a breakfast of dried fruit and jerky from his supplies. As they ate, he outlined his plan for the day. "We'll head southeast, keeping to the higher ground where the snow isn't as deep. If we make good time, we should reach Sam Harker's old trapping cabin by nightfall. It's abandoned now, but solid enough to provide shelter for the night." "And the Cowhounds?" Nora asked, the question that had been weighing on her mind. Henry's expression grew grim. "If we're lucky, last night's snowfall and our creek trick threw them off our trail completely. If not—" He checked the ammunition for his rifle. "I'll handle them if necessary." The calm certainty in his voice sent a shiver down Nora's spine. There was something both reassuring and slightly frightening about the competence with which Henry Grayson approached their desperate situation. After breakfast, Henry repacked his supplies, taking only what they would need for the journey to Fort Bayard. He found a heavy woolen shirt and a spare coat among his cache, offering the shirt to Nora to layer beneath her own clothing for extra warmth. "It's not exactly ladies' fashion," he apologized as she pulled it over her dress. Nora actually laughed at that, the sound surprising both of them. "I think we're well beyond worrying about fashion, Mr. Grayson Henry," she corrected herself. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I suppose we are. They set out as the day brightened around them, the world transformed by the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Everything glittered in the morning light, the forest a cathedral of white draped trees and sparkling ice. Under different circumstances, Nora might have found it breathtakingly beautiful. Now, she could only see it as an obstacle to their safety. Henry fashioned a better walking stick for her, and with his support, Nora found she could move at a reasonable pace despite her injured ankle. They kept to the ridgelines where possible, as Henry had suggested, both for easier walking and to maintain a better view of their surroundings. As they traveled, Henry pointed out tracks in the snow deer, rabbit, fox, and explained how to identify them. He showed her which plants could still be found beneath the snow that were edible or medicinal, and how to recognize the signs of changing weather in the clouds and wind. "How did you learn all this?" Nora asked after he demonstrated how to find north without a compass. "My father was a frontier scout for the army," Henry explained. "He taught me everything he knew about surviving in the wilderness. Later, as a marshal, I spent more time tracking fugitives through country like this than I did in towns or cities." "You're very good at it," Nora observed. "At surviving, I mean." Henry glanced at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "Surviving is easy enough. It's living that's proven more difficult." Before Nora could ask what he meant, Henry stopped abruptly, raising his hand for silence. He tilted his head, listening intently to something Nora couldn't hear. Then, without a word, he guided her behind the trunk of a massive pine tree and signaled for her to stay put. Henry moved forward alone, rifle ready, disappearing into the trees ahead. Nora waited, heart pounding, straining to hear whatever had alerted him. Minutes passed with excruciating slowness before Henry finally returned, his expression troubled. "Riders," he said quietly. "At least 2, maybe 3, about half a mile east of us, moving slowly like they're searching for something." "The Cowhounds," Nora whispered. "Most likely. No one else would be out here in this weather." Henry looked around, considering their options. "We need to change direction, head more south than east for a while. It will add miles to our journey, but it might keep us clear of them." They altered their course, moving more cautiously now, Henry frequently stopping to listen and check for signs of pursuit. The day wore on, the brief beauty of the morning giving way to the hard reality of travel through the winter wilderness. Clouds moved in, gray and threatening, and the wind picked up, driving tiny ice crystals against their faces. Nora's ankle worsened as the day progressed, until each step sent shooting pains up her leg. She tried to hide her discomfort, but Henry's watchful eyes missed nothing. "We need to rest," he said finally, as the afternoon light began to fade. "There's a rock overhang ahead that will provide some shelter." The overhang proved to be a shallow depression in a rocky hillside, just deep enough to shield them from the wind and any watching eyes. Henry cleared away snow to create a small, sheltered space and helped Nora sit with her back against the rock wall. "We're making good progress," he assured her as he checked her ankle again. "But we won't reach Harker's cabin by nightfall as I'd hoped. We'll need to make camp soon." Nora nodded, fighting against the despair that threatened to overwhelm her. "I'm slowing you down." "No," Henry said firmly. "You're doing remarkably well for someone who's never lived in conditions like this." He rummaged in his pack and produced a small tin of hard candies. "Here. Sugar will help your energy." Nora accepted a candy with surprise. "You carry sweets with you." A faint blush colored Henry's weathered cheeks. "My one luxury," he admitted. "Peppermint helps me think clearly." The simple, human confession warmed Nora more than the candy itself. This man, who had seemed so formidable and perhaps a bit frightening at first, was revealing himself to be thoughtful, kind, and even a little vulnerable in his own way. They rested for perhaps half an hour, sharing water and more of the dried meat from Henry's supplies. As they prepared to set out again, the first fat snowflakes began to fall from the leaden sky. "Another storm coming," Henry observed, looking up with concern. "We need to find shelter before it hits in earnest." They pushed on through the gathering snowfall, the world around them growing dimmer as both daylight and visibility diminished. Nora concentrated on placing one foot in front of the other, leaning heavily on her walking stick and occasionally on Henry's strong arm. The snow fell faster as they traveled, soon obscuring the landscape in a swirling white curtain that made it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead. Henry moved with confidence nonetheless, navigating by some internal map that Nora couldn't begin to understand. "How do you know where we're going?" she asked, raising her voice against the rising wind. "I've hunted these mountains for years," Henry replied, his arm steady around her waist as he helped her over a fallen log. "Even in a snowstorm, certain landmarks remain. That rock formation to our left," he nodded toward a barely visible shape in the whiteness, "means we're about a mile from a stand of old-growth pines where we can make shelter for the night." Nora marveled at his certainty, grateful beyond words for his knowledge and skill. Without Henry Grayson, she would have died several times over by now from the cowhound's bullets, from the wilderness itself, or from simple despair. The pine forest, when they reached it, provided some relief from the driving snow. The massive trees, centuries old and towering above them, created a canopy that caught much of the snowfall before it reached the forest floor. Here, the ground was covered with a thick carpet of pine needles overlaid with a thinner blanket of snow. "This will do," Henry said, surveying a small clearing surrounded by the largest of the pines. "The trees will break the wind, and there's material here to build a proper shelter." Despite her exhaustion, Nora insisted on helping as Henry constructed what he called a lean-to shelter against the trunk of the largest pine. He cut branches from smaller trees using a hatchet from his pack, arranging them against a fallen log to create a sloped roof and partial walls. Pine boughs layered thickly on the ground inside formed a surprisingly comfortable bed, and more branches woven together created a windbreak for the open side of the shelter. By the time they finished, full darkness had fallen, and the snowstorm raged around their little haven. Henry built a small fire at the shelter's opening, positioned to reflect heat inward while the smoke was carried away by the wind. "Not as comfortable as my cabin," he said as they huddled inside, "but it will keep us alive through the night." Nora looked at the simple structure with genuine admiration. "It's remarkable what you've created with just branches and snow. You could probably survive anywhere." Henry smiled slightly as he arranged their blankets. "My father used to say that nature provides everything you need to survive if you know how to look for it. Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Henry said softly. "He died during a blizzard much like this one, guiding an army patrol back to their fort after they got lost in Crow territory. Got them all back safely, but the exposure was too much for him." He poked at the fire, his expression distant. "I was 17. "I'm sorry," Nora said, reaching out to touch his arm gently. "My father died last year mining accident. The doctor said his heart gave out, but I think it was really the loss of my mother the year before that killed him. They were so devoted to each other." Henry looked at her, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "Is that why you stayed in Pino's Altos? Because of your father?" "Partly," Nora admitted. "After Mother died, he needed me. And then when he passed, the children at the school needed me. I'm their only teacher." She sighed, the reality of her situation hitting her anew. "I suppose I'll have to find a new position somewhere else now. I can never go back to Pino's Altos, can I?" "Not until the cowhounds are brought to justice," Henry confirmed. "But that might happen sooner than you think with your testimony. The territorial authorities have been wanting to capture them for years. And if they're never caught," the question hung between them in the firelit darkness. Henry was silent for a moment. "Then I'll help you start somewhere new," he said finally. "Somewhere they'll never find you." The simple promise, made without hesitation, brought tears to Nora's eyes. She brushed them away quickly, embarrassed by the display of emotion. "You've already done so much for me." Henry shook his head. "I've only done what anyone would do." "No," Nora said firmly. "What you're doing is extraordinary, Henry. Most men would have considered their duty fulfilled after the initial rescue, or certainly after their home was destroyed because of me. But you've never once complained or suggested that I'm not worth the trouble." Henry looked genuinely confused by her words. "Of course you're worth it," he said, as if this was the most obvious thing in the world. "You're brave, resilient, and you're trying to do the right thing despite the danger. How could I not help you?" Nora stared at him, seeing beneath the hardened exterior to the fundamentally good man beneath. In that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition, perhaps, that they were no longer simply strangers thrown together by circumstance, but something more. They ate a simple meal from Henry's supplies as the storm continued to rage outside their shelter. The small fire kept the worst of the cold at bay, and the pine bough bed proved surprisingly comfortable. As exhaustion overtook them, Henry insisted that Nora take the spot furthest from the opening where it was warmest. "I'll keep watch for a while," he said, settling himself near the fire where he could see out into the storm. "Try to get some sleep." Nora was too tired to argue. Wrapped in blankets, with the scent of pine surrounding her and the solid presence of Henry Grayson between her and the wilderness, she drifted into the deepest sleep she'd had since fleeing Pino's Altos. She woke once in the night, momentarily disoriented, to find that Henry had finally succumbed to sleep himself. He was still seated upright, but his head had drooped forward, his breathing deep and even. In sleep, the hard lines of his face softened, making him appear younger and more vulnerable. Nora watched him for a moment, struck by a sudden wave of tenderness for this complex man who had risked everything to save her. Then she closed her eyes and returned to her own dreams. Morning brought a transformed world. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a pristine landscape of untouched snow that sparkled blindingly in the clear sunlight. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, but the sky above was a perfect, limitless blue. Henry was already awake and rebuilding the fire when Nora opened her eyes. He greeted her with a quiet good morning and handed her a cup of pine needle tea. "How's the ankle?" he asked as she stretched carefully. Nora tested it, surprised to find the pain had diminished somewhat overnight. "Better, I think. Still sore, but not as bad as yesterday." Henry nodded with satisfaction. "Good. We have a long way to go today." He hesitated, then added, "I scouted a bit while you were sleeping. No sign of the cowhounds, but that doesn't mean they've given up. The storm would have forced them to seek shelter too." They broke camp after a quick breakfast, Henry carefully obscuring any signs of their presence before they set out. The fresh snow made travel more difficult, but the clear weather meant they could move more directly toward their destination without fear of becoming lost. As they walked, Nora found herself studying Henry more closely than before. In the bright morning light, she noticed details she had missed previously, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he was thinking, the scar on his left hand that matched the one on his cheekbone, the careful gentleness with which he helped her over difficult terrain despite his obvious physical strength. "What?" he asked, catching her watching him as he scouted the path ahead. Nora felt herself blush. "I was just thinking that you're not what I expected," Henry raised an eyebrow. And what did you expect? I'm not sure, she admitted. When I first saw you rising from behind that snowdrift like some avenging spirit, I thought you might be as dangerous as the men who were chasing me. But you're not like them at all. No. There was a wariness in his question. No, Nora said confidently. You use your strength to protect, not to harm. There's a kindness in you that they could never understand. Henry looked away, clearly uncomfortable with her assessment. I've done my share of harm, he said quietly. More than you know. Perhaps, Nora conceded. But I judge people by their actions now, not their past. And everything you've done since we met has been to help me, often at great risk to yourself. Henry didn't respond, but something in his expression softened slightly, and when he helped her across a particularly deep snowdrift a few minutes later, his hand lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary. They traveled steadily through the morning, making good progress in the clear weather. The landscape gradually changed as they moved southeast, the rugged mountains giving way to more gently rolling terrain. They were entering the transition zone between the high country and the lower elevations that would eventually lead to Fort Bayard. Around midday, they paused to rest in the shelter of a rock formation that Henry called the Sentinels, two tall pillars of weathered stone standing like watchful guardians on a small rise. From this vantage point, they could see for miles across the snow-covered landscape. Henry shared the last of their jerky and dried fruit as they sat side by side, backs against sun-warmed stone. Harker's cabin is about 4 miles ahead, he said, pointing toward a distant line of trees. We should reach it well before dark if we keep this pace. Nora nodded, grateful for the rest but anxious to continue their journey. Every mile they traveled brought them closer to safety and further from the cowhounds. Tell me about your life in Pinot's Altos, Henry said unexpectedly as they prepared to move on. Before all this happened. Surprised by his interest, Nora considered the question. It was quiet, she said finally. Peaceful for the most part. I taught at the schoolhouse 6 days a week. We had 28 children this year, ranging from 5 to 16. On Sundays, I played piano for the church services, and in the evenings, I often read or wrote letters to friends back east. Sounds lonely, Henry observed, echoing her own words to him from the night before. Nora smiled slightly at the turnaround. Perhaps it was a bit. After my parents died, I didn't have much family left, just the community, really. She paused, thinking. But I was content, I think. I felt useful. The children needed me. Were you ever married? Henry asked, then immediately looked embarrassed. Forgive me, that's too personal a question. No, it's all right, Nora assured him. No, I've never married. There was someone once back in Santa Fe where I grew up. Thomas Wilcox, a lawyer. We were engaged briefly, but... She shrugged. He wanted a wife who would be content with social gatherings and charity committees, not teaching in a mining town. When my father's investments failed and he moved us to Pinot's Altos to work the mines, Thomas and I parted ways. Henry was watching her carefully. Do you regret it, not marrying him? Nora considered this honestly. No, she said finally. I don't think we would have suited in the long run. I've always been too independent for the life he wanted. She looked at Henry curiously. What about you? Were you ever married? A shadow passed over his face. Yes, once. Her name was Sarah. She died in a fire while I was away on martial business. His voice was flat, emotionless, but Nora could see the pain beneath his controlled expression. That was 6 years ago. I'm so sorry, Nora said softly, understanding now another piece of the puzzle that was Henry Grayson. Loss had shaped them both. Henry stood abruptly, signaling an end to the conversation. We should keep moving. The weather's holding for now, but that could change quickly in these mountains. They set off again. the personal moment between them fading as they returned their focus to the journey ahead. Yet something had shifted. Nora thought a deepening of understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of trust that went beyond their immediate circumstances. The afternoon passed uneventfully as they made their way toward Harker's cabin. The cold remained intense, but the bright sunshine made it more bearable than the previous day's storm. Nora's ankle continued to improve with the steady walking, though by late afternoon it was throbbing again from the exertion. They were within sight of the tree line Henry had pointed out earlier when he suddenly stopped, raising his hand for silence. His body tensed, and Nora immediately recognized the alertness that had preceded their previous encounters with danger. "What is it?" she whispered, her heart racing. Henry didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead with fierce concentration. Then, to Nora's surprise, he relaxed slightly. "Deer," he said, pointing to a barely visible movement at the edge of the distant trees. "A good sign means there's likely no one else around. Deer have better senses than most humans." Nora released the breath she'd been holding. "You had me worried for a moment." Henry gave her a sidelong glance, a hint of apology in his expression. "Force of habit. In my experience, it's better to be cautious without cause than careless even once." They continued toward the tree line, and as they drew closer, Nora could make out the shape of a small cabin nestled among the pines. It was a simple structure, not unlike Henry's destroyed home but smaller and more weathered, with a sagging roof and a stone chimney that listed slightly to one side. "Harker's place," Henry confirmed as they approached. "Not much to look at, but the walls are solid, and it has a fireplace that still draws well enough." The interior of the cabin was dusty and showed signs of occasional use by passing travelers, a common courtesy of the frontier, where shelter was left open for those in need. There was a crude bed frame in one corner, a small table with a single chair, and a fireplace that took up most of one wall. Animal pelts hung from pegs along another wall, left behind by the original owner or subsequent visitors. Henry immediately set about making the place habitable, clearing debris from the fireplace and checking for any unwanted wildlife that might have taken up residence. Finding none, he began building a fire while Nora swept the floor with a makeshift broom of bound twigs. By the time darkness fell, they had transformed the abandoned cabin into a reasonably comfortable shelter. The fire burned steadily in the hearth, casting a warm glow throughout the single room. Henry had found an old Dutch oven in a corner and was using it to prepare a stew from the last of their provisions, and some dried herbs he'd discovered hanging from the rafters. "How do you know this place?" Nora asked as she sat on the edge of the bed, which they had covered with fresh pine boughs and their blankets. Henry stirred the stew, the firelight highlighting the strong planes of his face. "Sam Harker was a trapper who worked these mountains for nearly 40 years. He was ancient when I first met him, must have been close to 70 then. He taught me some of my best trapping techniques." A fond smile touched Henry's lips. "Cantankerous old man, but fair and honest. He died in his sleep about 3 years ago, right in that bed where you're sitting." "Oh." Nora started to rise, but Henry chuckled. He'd be pleased someone was making use of his cabin, he assured her. Harker believed that anything left behind after death should serve the living. "It's why he never bothered to be buried in a proper cemetery, told me once to just leave his body for the mountain lions when his time came." "Did you?" Nora asked, fascinated despite herself. Henry nodded. "It was what he wanted. I wrapped him in his favorite bearskin and left him on a ridge overlooking the valley he loved. Seemed fitting somehow." The simple dignity of the story touched Nora deeply. There was a different kind of honor out here in the wilderness, harsher, perhaps, than the civilized world she knew, but in some ways more honest. They ate the stew directly from the Dutch oven, sharing the single spoon Henry had in his pack. The simple meal tasted better than any fine dining Nora had experienced in Santa Fe, hunger and gratitude lending it flavors no chef could replicate. After they had eaten, Henry checked Nora's ankle again, noting with satisfaction that the swelling had continued to decrease. "Another day's rest would be ideal," he said, "but we can't afford the delay. The cowhounds are still out there and our supplies are running low." "How far to Fort Bayard from here?" Nora asked. "About 12 miles, Henry replied. "A long day's journey in these conditions, but possible if we start at first light." Nora nodded her understanding. "Then that's what we'll do." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire and listening to the occasional crack of branches outside as the temperature dropped further. The howl of a distant wolf punctuated the night, followed by the answering calls of its pack. "They're beautiful animals," Henry commented, seeing Nora's expression, "and they generally avoid humans unless desperate. That pack is probably tracking the same deer we saw earlier." "You love it out here, don't you?" Nora observed, "despite the dangers and the hardships." Henry considered this. "Yes," he said finally. "There's a clarity to life in the wilderness. Every day presents direct challenges that must be met. Survival depends on your skills, your knowledge, and sometimes just your will to continue. It's honest in a way that civilization often isn't." "But lonely," Nora said softly. Henry met her eyes across the firelit room. "Yes," he acknowledged. "Lonely." There was something in his gaze that made Nora's heart beat faster, a vulnerability perhaps, or a question he couldn't quite bring himself to ask. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Henry stood abruptly. "You should get some sleep. I'll take first watch, then wake you in a few hours." "Henry," Nora said, his name still feeling new on her lips, "you need rest too. We haven't seen any sign of the cowhounds all day. Perhaps they've given up the chase." "Perhaps," Henry said, though his tone made it clear he didn't believe it. "But I'll feel better keeping watch all the same." Recognizing the stubborn set of his jaw, Nora didn't argue further. She arranged the blankets on the bed and removed her boots, though she kept the rest of her clothing on against the cold that seeped through the cabin's walls despite the fire. As she drifted toward sleep, she watched Henry through half-closed eyes. He sat in the chair near the window, rifle across his knees, his profile strong against the firelight. There was something profoundly comforting about his presence, this man who had become, in the space of 2 days, the person she trusted most in the world. Her last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was that she was falling in love with Henry Grayson, and what a complicated, impossible thing that might prove to be. Nora woke to the gray light of pre-dawn and the sound of movement in the cabin. Opening her eyes, she saw Henry already preparing for their departure, packing their few belongings efficiently. "Morning," he said when he noticed her watching him. "There's coffee." He nodded toward a battered tin cup sitting on the hearth stones near the fire. Nora sat up, pleasantly surprised. "Coffee? Where did that come from?" "Found a stash in an old canister under a floorboard," Henry explained. "Sam always did have hiding places for his treasures. It's probably years old, but still better than pine needle tea." The coffee was indeed old and bitter, but Nora savored it nonetheless, appreciating both the warmth and the familiar comfort of the drink. As they shared a sparse breakfast of the last of their supplies, Henry outlined the day's journey. "We'll follow Coldwater Creek for the first few miles," he said, sketching a rough map in the cabin's dirt floor with a stick. "It runs southeast toward Fort Bayard. The terrain is easier along the creek bed, though we'll have to be cautious. It's the most obvious route, so if the cowhounds are still tracking us, That's where they might look. And if we encounter them? Nora asked, voicing the fear that had never quite left her mind. Henry's expression hardened. Then I'll deal with them. He checked his rifle and revolver methodically. But with luck, we'll reach the fort before nightfall without incident. They set out as the first true light of day touched the eastern horizon, the world around them still and silent in the grip of winter. Nora's ankle felt better after the night's rest, allowing her to move more freely than before, though she still relied on the walking stick Henry had made for her. The creek Henry had mentioned was partially frozen but still flowing beneath a crust of ice in its center. They followed its winding course as it cut through the landscape, the terrain gradually descending as they moved southeast. The weather remained clear, though clouds gathering on the western horizon suggested another storm might be approaching. They traveled in companionable silence for the most part, conserving energy for the long journey ahead. Occasionally, Henry would point out something of interest: animal tracks in the snow, a particular plant or tree, or a landmark that helped him navigate. Nora absorbed these lessons eagerly, finding herself increasingly fascinated by Henry's deep knowledge of the natural world. Around midday, they stopped briefly to rest in a sunny clearing. Nora sat on a fallen log while Henry scouted ahead, returning with a handful of rose hips that he offered to her. For energy, he explained. They're high in things the body needs, especially in winter. Nora accepted them gratefully, the tart taste unusual but not unpleasant. You're a wealth of knowledge, Henry Grayson, he shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. Just practical experience. Anyone who lives out here long enough learns these things. No, Nora shook her head. It's more than that. You have a gift for understanding this land, for reading it like others read books. Henry considered this, then said quietly, I had good teachers. My father, old Sam Harker, even the Crow Scouts I worked with during my martial days. But mostly I learned by making mistakes and living to correct them. As they prepared to continue their journey, Henry suddenly froze, his head tilted in the listening posture that Nora had come to recognize as a warning. She immediately fell silent, watching as he scanned their surroundings with intense concentration. Someone's coming, he whispered after a moment. From downstream, at least 2 horses moving slowly. Nora's heart raced. The cowhounds, most likely. Henry was already guiding her away from the creek bed and toward a stand of pine trees on higher ground. We need to get out of sight. They moved as quickly and quietly as possible, Nora ignoring the renewed pain in her ankle as they climbed away from the creek. Henry found a position behind a fallen tree that offered both concealment and a clear view of the approach from below. Stay down, he instructed, his rifle ready. If anything happens to me, keep heading southeast. The fort is about 8 miles that way, he pointed. Follow the creek as much as possible, but stay on high ground where you can see what's ahead. Nothing's going to happen to you, Nora said firmly, refusing to contemplate the alternative. Henry gave her a quick, surprisingly tender smile. Just in case, he said, then returned his attention to the creek bed below. They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, 2 riders appeared, moving cautiously along the creek. Even from a distance, Nora recognized the distinctive bulk of Rex Calhoun on a large bay horse. Beside him rode his brother Miles, leaning forward in his saddle as he studied the ground ahead looking for tracks. Nora realized with a chill. Where's the third brother? She whispered. Don't know, Henry murmured back, his eyes never leaving the riders. Could be scouting separately, or maybe he was injured in our earlier encounter. The Calhounds stopped directly below their position, apparently discussing something. Though they were too far away for their words to be clearly heard, Their gestures suggested some disagreement about which direction to take. "They've lost our trail," Henry whispered with satisfaction. "The creek and yesterday's sunshine melted enough snow to obscure our tracks." As they watched, Rex Calhoun made a decisive gesture downstream, and the brothers continued in that direction, moving away from where Nora and Henry were hidden. "They think we're sticking to the creek bed," Henry said as the riders disappeared around a bend. "That buys us some time, but we need to be even more careful now. They're closer than I'd like." They waited several more minutes to ensure the Calhouns were truly gone before emerging from their hiding place. Henry altered their route slightly, keeping to higher ground parallel to the creek rather than following its course directly. The afternoon wore on, each mile bringing them closer to safety, but also draining their remaining strength. Nora's ankle, which had improved overnight, began to pain her severely again with the increased exertion and uneven terrain. She tried not to show it, but Henry's observant eyes missed nothing. "We'll rest more frequently," he decided after noticing her wince for the third time in as many minutes. "Better to arrive at the fort after dark than not arrive at all because you've injured yourself further." Nora started to protest, but realized he was right. "Thank you," she said instead. "I'm sorry to slow us down." "You're not slowing us down," Henry assured her. "You're doing remarkably well for someone who wasn't raised to this kind of life." The simple praise warmed Nora more than she would have expected. From Henry Grayson, such words carried genuine weight. He was not a man given to empty flattery. They continued their journey, pausing briefly every hour or so to rest Nora's ankle. The clouds that had been gathering to the west gradually spread across the sky, dimming the afternoon light and bringing a bitter chill to the air. "Snow coming," Henry observed, glancing up at the leaden sky. "We need to make better time if possible." Nora nodded her understanding and pushed herself harder, gritting her teeth against the pain. They had come too far, endured too much, to fail now because of her weakness. The landscape gradually changed as they continued southeast, the wilderness giving way to more open country. Occasionally, they spotted signs of human presence: an old fence line, the remains of a campsite, a crude trail cutting across their path. "We're getting closer to civilization," Henry confirmed when Nora remarked on these changes. "Fort Bayard should be visible from the next ridge if the weather holds." The thought of reaching safety at last gave Nora renewed energy. They climbed the ridge Henry had indicated, the exertion leaving them both breathing hard in the thin, cold air. At the top, Henry pointed to a distant collection of buildings nestled in a valley perhaps 4 miles away. "Fort Bayard," he said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "We'll make it before dark if we push on." Nora stared at the distant fort with a mixture of relief and unexpected sadness. Their journey was nearly over, which meant her time with Henry was coming to an end as well. The realization affected her more deeply than she would have anticipated just days ago. As they stood on the ridge, the first snowflakes began to fall, gentle at first but quickly increasing as the storm moved in from the west. Henry frowned at the darkening sky. "We'd better hurry," he said. "This looks to be a significant storm." They had just started down the other side of the ridge when a shot rang out, the bullet striking a tree trunk inches from Nora's head. Henry reacted instantly, shoving her to the ground and covering her body with his own as a second shot whistled overhead. "Stay down," he commanded, already returning fire in the direction the shots had come from. Nora pressed herself against the snow-covered ground, terror and adrenaline coursing through her body. More shots were exchanged, the reports echoing across the ridge. Through the increasing snowfall, Nora could make out movement among the trees to their right, at least 2 figures advancing on their position. "It's all 3 of them," Henry said grimly as he reloaded his rifle. They must have split up to search a wider area. He glanced at Nora, his expression resolute. I'm going to draw their fire. When I do, I want you to make for the fort. Don't stop, don't look back. Just run as hard as you can. No, Nora grabbed his arm. I won't leave you to face them alone. This isn't a debate, Henry said firmly. You're the witness. You need to reach the fort to testify against them. I'll be right behind you. Before Nora could protest further, Henry rose to a crouch and fired several rapid shots, then sprinted to a position about 30 yards to their left, drawing the cowhound's fire away from her. Go! He shouted as bullets followed his movement, splintering bark and sending snow flying. Heart pounding, Nora forced herself to her feet and began running down the ridge toward the distant fort. The deep snow made it difficult, and her injured ankle screamed in protest. But fear gave her speed she didn't know she possessed. Behind her, the gunfire continued, punctuated by shouts and the occasional crash of underbrush as the combatants moved through the woods. Nora wanted desperately to look back, to make sure Henry was all right, but she kept her focus forward as he had instructed. The snow fell more heavily now, limiting visibility and making her progress even more difficult. Nora stumbled frequently, each time forcing herself back up to continue the desperate flight toward safety. Her breath came in ragged gasps, creating clouds of vapor in the freezing air. She had covered perhaps half a mile when she heard heavy footsteps behind her. Risking a glance over her shoulder, she saw with horror that Jeb Calhoun, the youngest brother, had broken off from the others and was pursuing her directly. His face was contorted with rage as he raised his pistol. Nora threw herself sideways just as he fired, the bullet passing through the space where she had been a moment before. She scrambled behind a large rock, frantically searching for some way to defend herself or escape. Jeb advanced slowly, a cruel smile spreading across his young face. Nowhere to run now, teacher lady, he called. Time to finish this. Nora pressed herself against the rock, mind racing. She had no weapon, no means of defending herself. If she ran, Jeb would shoot her in the back. If she stayed, he would execute her where she stood. Either way, she was about to die. The sound of a horse's hooves pounding through the snow came so suddenly that both Nora and Jeb turned in surprise toward the source. Through the swirling snow, a rider emerged at full gallop, rifle raised. It was Henry, mounted on what Nora recognized as Rex Calhoun's bay horse. Before Jeb could react, Henry fired. The young outlaw staggered backward, clutching his chest, then collapsed face first into the snow. Henry reined in beside Nora, extending his hand. Come on, he urged. The other two are right behind me. Nora grabbed his arm and he swung her up behind him on the horse with surprising strength. She barely had time to wrap her arms around his waist before the bay leapt forward, powerful muscles bunching as it carried them down the slope toward Fort Bayard. Are you hurt? Henry called over his shoulder as they galloped through the increasing snowfall. No, Nora managed to reply, her arms tight around him. What about you? I'm fine, Henry said, though Nora thought his voice sounded strained. I managed to get the drop on Rex, took his horse. Miles is wounded but still dangerous. We need to reach the fort before they regroup. The horse struggled through the deepening snow, its pace slowing despite Henry's urging. Behind them, Nora could hear distant shouts, the remaining Calhoun brothers, still in pursuit despite everything. They don't give up, she said, amazement mixing with her fear. Men like that can't afford to, Henry replied grimly. For them, it's a matter of survival now. If you testify, they hang. The fort grew larger as they approached, its walls a promise of safety in the gathering storm. They were perhaps half a mile away when the bay horse suddenly stumbled, nearly sending them both flying. Henry managed to keep them mounted, but the horse's gait had changed. It was favoring its right foreleg. "Must have stepped in a hole," Henry muttered. "We can't push him much harder." They continued at a slower pace, the horse laboring through the snow. The shots from behind had stopped, but Nora knew the cowhounds were still coming. The snow would slow them as well, but they wouldn't stop until they had silenced the only witness who could send them to the gallows. When they were within sight of the fort's main gate, Henry suddenly slumped forward in the saddle. Nora grabbed him, alarmed to feel wetness soaking through his coat. "Henry, you're bleeding." "It's nothing," he said, though his voice was noticeably weaker. "Just a scratch." "Don't lie to me," Nora said fiercely, supporting him as best she could while they continued toward the fort. "How bad is it?" Henry didn't answer immediately, focusing his energy on staying upright in the saddle. Finally, he admitted, "Took a bullet in the side during the fight. Not too deep, I think, but it's bleeding more than I expected." Nora's heart clenched with fear. After everything they'd been through, the thought of losing Henry now was unbearable. "Just hold on," she urged. "We're almost there." As they approached the fort's gate, a sentry called out a challenge. Nora shouted back, her voice carrying across the open ground, "Help us! We're being pursued by outlaws. This man is injured." The gates swung open and soldiers rushed out to meet them, rifles ready and pointed toward the white expanse behind them. Strong hands helped Nora and Henry down from the exhausted horse as others scanned the perimeter for signs of pursuit. "The Cowhound gang," Henry managed to tell the sergeant who approached them. "They murdered Marshal Davis in Pino's Altos. This woman is a witness. They've been hunting her for days." The sergeant nodded sharply. "We know the Cowhounds. Been wanting to get our hands on them for a while." He turned to his men. "Jackson, take a patrol out, see if you can spot them, and get the doctor for this man." Nora refused to leave Henry's side as they were escorted inside the fort's walls. Only when they reached the infirmary and the army doctor took charge did she allow herself to be led to a separate room where a kindly officer's wife helped her change into dry clothing and brought her hot tea. "Your friend will be all right," the woman assured her. "Doctor Patterson is the best surgeon in the territory. He's patched up worse wounds than that." Nora nodded gratefully, but her thoughts remained with Henry. Friend seemed such an inadequate word for what he had become to her in the span of just a few days. She had entrusted him with her life, and he had protected it at the risk of his own. Beyond that, something deeper had grown between them, a connection forged in danger and hardship that felt more real than any relationship she had known before. It was nearly an hour before she was allowed to see Henry. He lay on a narrow bed in the infirmary, his torso wrapped in clean bandages, his face pale but composed. He smiled when he saw her, and Nora felt her heart lift in response. "The doctor says you'll recover," she said, taking the chair beside his bed. "Though you'll need to rest for a few weeks." Henry grimaced. "Not my favorite activity, but I suppose I don't have much choice." "No, you don't," Nora said firmly. "You've done quite enough heroics for now." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only when Henry asked, "Any word on the Cowhounds?" "The patrol returned a little while ago," Nora told him. "They found Jeb's body where you left him, but no sign of Rex or Miles. The commander has sent telegrams to all the nearby settlements and ranches warning them to be on the lookout." Henry nodded, unsurprised. "They won't give up easily, but they'll be more cautious now, especially with Miles wounded." He looked at Nora seriously. "You'll still need protection until they're captured. The commander has already assigned 2 soldiers to guard me," Nora assured him. "And a U.S. Marshal is on his way from Santa Fe to take my statement and arrange for formal charges to be filed." "Good," Henry said, relaxing slightly against his pillows. "That's good. Another silence fell, this one more charged than before. Nora found herself studying Henry's face, memorizing its details. Despite his pallor, he was handsome in a rugged way that appealed to her far more than Thomas Wilcox's polished good looks ever had. "What will you do now?" Henry asked finally. "After the marshal takes your statement," Nora had been pondering this same question. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I can't return to Pinot's Altos while the Calhounds are still free, and perhaps not even after they're captured. There will be those who were friendly with them, who might bear a grudge. You could go back to Santa Fe," Henry suggested, "or further east, start fresh somewhere far from here." The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness. "Perhaps," Nora said noncommittally. "What about you? Where will you go when you've recovered?" Henry looked away, his expression unreadable. "I don't know. My cabin is gone. I suppose I could rebuild, but—" He trailed off, then admitted quietly, "The thought of returning to that solitude doesn't hold the appeal it once did." Nora's heart beat faster at his words. "Because of what happened?" "Because of you," Henry said simply, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. "You were right about the loneliness. I'd gotten so used to it that I stopped noticing until you made me see it again." Nora reached out hesitantly, taking his hand in hers. Perhaps neither of us needs to decide immediately. We could take some time to consider our options." Henry's fingers tightened around hers. "I'd like that," he said softly, "over the next 2 weeks, as Henry recovered from his wound and Nora gave her formal statement to the U.S. Marshal, who arrived from Santa Fe. They spent much of their time together at Fort Bayard. The commander had generously provided Nora with quarters in his own home, while Henry remained in the infirmary until the doctor declared him well enough to move to the officers' quarters. During those days, they talked more freely than they had during their desperate journey through the wilderness. Nora learned about Henry's childhood in Colorado, his years as a marshal, and the tragedy that had sent him into self-imposed exile. In turn, she shared stories of her own life, her education in Santa Fe, her parents' love story, her hopes and disappointments. In the evenings, they often sat together on the infirmary porch, watching the sunset over the mountains where they had so recently fought for their lives. Sometimes they were joined by officers or their wives, but frequently they were alone, sharing a companionable silence that grew increasingly comfortable. 3 weeks after their arrival at Fort Bayard, news came that Rex Calhoun had been captured near the Arizona border. Miles had died of his wounds before they reached safety, and with Jeb already dead, the notorious Calhoun gang was finished at last. "You're free now," Henry told Nora as they walked slowly around the fort's perimeter that evening. His strength had returned, though he still moved with a slight stiffness from his healing wound. "You can go wherever you choose without looking over your shoulder." Nora nodded, feeling a curious mixture of relief and uncertainty. "And what about you? What will you do now?" Henry stopped walking, turning to face her directly. In the weeks since their arrival, he had trimmed his beard and cut his hair, but his eyes remained the same blue and steady, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "That depends," he said carefully, "on what you decide." "What I decide," Nora repeated, her heart beginning to race. Henry took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "Nora, these past weeks getting to know you properly, without the immediate threat of death hanging over us, have been the happiest I've known in years." He paused, then continued more softly, "I find I don't want them to end." Nora felt a smile begin to spread across her face. "Nor do I." Encouraged by her response, Henry took her hands in his. "I've been offered a position as a scout for the Army, based here at Fort Bayard. It would mean a steady income, a chance to use my skills, but without the solitude that was slowly killing me before." His thumbs traced gentle patterns on her palms. The commander mentioned that the fort's school is in need of a teacher as well. Nora's smile widened. Did he indeed? He did, Henry confirmed, his own lips curving upward. And I thought I hope that perhaps you might consider staying here with me. The last words came out in a rush, as if he feared losing his nerve if he didn't say them quickly. Nora stepped closer to him, her heart full. Henry Grayson, are you asking me to court you? I'm asking for much more than that, Henry said softly. But I'll settle for courting to begin with, if that's what you prefer. In answer, Nora raised herself on tiptoe and pressed her lips gently to his. It was a brief kiss, sweet and full of promise, but when she pulled back, she saw in Henry's eyes the same emotion that filled her own heart. I would like nothing better than to stay here with you, she said. Whether as your sweetheart, your wife, or simply your friend, though I admit, I have a preference among those options. Henry's smile was radiant as he drew her into his arms. As do I, he murmured before capturing her lips again in a deeper, more passionate kiss that left them both breathless. Spring came to the mountains around Fort Bayard, melting the snows and bringing new life to the land that had nearly claimed Nora's life months before. She stood on the porch of the small house she now shared with Henry, watching as he split firewood in the yard, his movements strong and sure, showing no sign of his winter injury. They had been married in a simple ceremony at the fort's chapel just as the first wildflowers began to bloom. The commander had given them this house as a wedding gift, a gesture of gratitude, he said, for Nora's willingness to take on the education of the fort's children and Henry's invaluable service as scout and hunting guide for the soldiers. Life at Fort Bayard suited them both. Nora found that teaching the mix of Army officers' children and those from nearby settlements gave her a sense of purpose similar to what she had known in Pino's Altos, while Henry's position allowed him to use his wilderness skills without returning to the isolation that had marked his years after Sarah's death. In the evenings, they would often sit together on their porch, watching the sunset and planning for the future, perhaps children of their own someday, a larger house, maybe even a small ranch when Henry's contract with the Army ended. But neither was in a hurry. For now, they were content to build their life together one day at a time, grateful for the unexpected journey that had brought them to each other. Sometimes, on clear nights when the stars spread like diamonds across the vast New Mexico sky, Henry would take Nora's hand and lead her to the ridge behind their home. There, with the fort's lights twinkling below and the wilderness stretching endlessly beyond, they would stand together in comfortable silence, remembering the desperate days that had forged their bond and appreciating the peace they had found. You ever regret it? Nora asked one such night, nestled against Henry's side as they gazed out over the landscape. Helping me that day, taking on the cowhounds, losing your cabin. Henry's arm tightened around her waist. Never, he said with quiet certainty. Everything I lost led me to everything I found. He looked down at her, his eyes reflecting starlight. And what I found is worth more than anything I had before. Nora raised her face for his kiss, thinking how strange and wonderful life could be, how a moment of terrible danger had ultimately led to such profound happiness. The outlaws had chased her into the frozen wilderness, and a cowboy had ambushed them from behind a snowdrift. In doing so, he had not only saved her life, but given her a love greater than she had ever imagined possible. As spring turned to summer, and summer to fall, their life together at Fort Bayard continued to flourish. Nora's school grew as more settlers moved to the area, attracted by the protection the fort offered and the fertile valley lands nearby. Henry's reputation as a scout and hunter spread throughout the territory, bringing occasional requests for his services from ranchers, lawmen, and even the territorial governor. In the winter of 1880, almost exactly a year after their first meeting, Nora discovered she was expecting their first child. The news filled them both with joy and a touch of apprehension. Parenthood was a frontier neither had explored before. "A son," Henry declared confidently as he laid his hand on Nora's still flat stomach one evening. "He'll have your intelligence and my outdoorsmanship." "Or a daughter," Nora countered, smiling, "with your courage and my stubbornness." "Either way," Henry said, pulling her close, "the child will be loved beyond measure." Their son, Frederick Henry Grayson, was born on a crisp autumn day in 1881. He had Henry's blue eyes and Nora's determined chin, and from his earliest days showed signs of inheriting both his father's affinity for the natural world and his mother's quick mind. As young Frederick grew, so did the settlement around Fort Bayard. What had been a military outpost with a few scattered homes became a proper town, with a general store, a hotel, and eventually a proper schoolhouse built specifically for Nora's growing number of students. Henry, still serving as scout for the army, but increasingly taking on the role of informal lawman for the civilian settlement, suggested they build a home of their own on a piece of land about a mile from the fort, close enough for convenience, but with enough space around it to satisfy his need for a connection to the wilderness. The house they built was larger than their fort quarters but still modest, 3 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen where Nora enjoyed experimenting with cooking, and a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides, perfect for watching sunsets or approaching storms. Henry insisted on including one special feature: a stone fireplace in the main room, constructed from rocks he personally gathered from the creek bed where they had waded to escape the cowhounds years before. "A reminder," he told Nora, "of how close we came to losing everything before we even knew what we had." As the years passed, their family grew again with the birth of their daughter, Sarah Eleanor, named partly for Henry's first wife in a gesture that Nora had suggested, and that had brought tears to Henry's eyes when she proposed it. "A way of honoring the past while embracing our future," Nora had said, and Henry had kissed her with a depth of feeling that still took her breath away after years of marriage. Their children grew strong and healthy in the clean mountain air, equally at home in their mother's schoolroom and on horseback with their father, exploring the wilderness that had once nearly claimed Nora's life, but now provided a playground for her children's adventures. By 1889, a decade after that fateful winter meeting, Henry and Nora Grayson had become respected fixtures in the community that had grown up around Fort Bayard. Henry, having finally left Army service, now served as the town's sheriff, while Nora had been appointed head mistress of the school that now employed 3 additional teachers. On the 10th anniversary of the day Henry had rescued Nora from the cowhounds, they returned to the site of his old cabin, now long reclaimed by the wilderness. The journey, once so desperate and frightening, was now a pleasant 2-day ride on good horses, with their children old enough to accompany them. As 8-year-old Frederick and 6-year-old Sarah explored the ruins of the cabin under their father's watchful eye, Henry took Nora's hand and led her to the now barely visible snowdrift where he had waited in ambush that winter day. "I never told you," he said quietly, "but I almost didn't stop here that day. I was on my way back from Fort Bayard, tired and wanting nothing more than my own fireside. I heard gunshots in the distance and nearly convinced myself it was none of my concern." Nora squeezed his hand, imagining how differently their lives might have unfolded if he had made that choice. "What changed your mind?" Henry looked at her, his blue eyes as clear and direct as the day they had first met, though now surrounded by the lines that a decade of smiling had etched into his tanned face. I heard a woman's voice, just a cry, carried on the wind, and something in me couldn't ignore it. He shook his head, still seeming amazed by the memory. So I waited behind that snowdrift, thinking I'd scare off whoever was causing trouble. I never expected to find your future wife being chased by notorious outlaws, Nora finished for him, smiling. Henry laughed, the sound warming her heart as it always did. Exactly. But from the moment I saw you, even dirt-smudged, half-frozen, and terrified, there was something that told me my life was about to change forever. Nora leaned against him, watching their children play in the meadow that had once held Henry's cabin. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The solitude, the simplicity of life out here." Henry considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he admitted. "There are days when the responsibilities of sheriff and husband and father feel heavy, when I remember the freedom of answering to no one but myself." He tightened his arm around her waist. "But then, I think of what that freedom cost me, the loneliness, the emptiness of days that blended into each other without meaning or purpose." He turned to face her fully, his expression solemn but his eyes full of warmth. "What I have now, you, Frederick, Sarah, our home, our place in the community, it's a different kind of freedom. The freedom to love and be loved, to make a difference in the lives of others, to build something that will outlast me." Nora rose on tiptoe to kiss him, marveling at how this man still made her heart race after a decade of marriage. "I do believe that's the longest speech I've ever heard you make, Henry Grayson." Henry grinned, the expression transforming his face in the way that had first made Nora realize she was falling in love with him. "Well, 10 years with a schoolteacher was bound to improve my eloquence eventually." Their children's shouts drew their attention back to the present, and they spent the rest of the day exploring the area, Henry showing Frederick and Sarah the cave that had sheltered them during their flight, the creek where they had waded to throw off the cowhounds, the ridge from which they had first seen Fort Bayard in the distance. That night, camped in a meadow near the ruins of the cabin, with their children sleeping soundly in a small tent Henry had brought for them, Nora and Henry lay together under the stars, the same stars that had watched over them during their desperate journey a decade earlier. "Thank you," Nora said softly as Henry's arms held her close against the mountain chill. "For what?" "For being the kind of man who couldn't ignore a cry for help," she said. "For risking everything to save a stranger, for loving me even when it meant giving up the life you had built for yourself." Henry kissed her gently. "Loving you was the easiest decision I ever made," he said. "And everything that came after, our children, our home, the life we've built together, has only proven how right that decision was." As they drifted toward sleep, wrapped in each other's arms under the vast New Mexico sky, Nora reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had brought them to this moment. A path that had begun in terror and desperation, but had led to a love deeper and more enduring than she could have imagined possible. The outlaws had chased her into the frozen wilderness, and a cowboy had ambushed them from behind a snowdrift. And in that moment of violence and fear, the first seeds of a lifetime of love had been planted, seeds that had grown into the rich, full life they now shared together.